Glad to see everybody here on the first day of the year. It's so nice to meet in the Lord's house together on the first day of the year. Makes, hopefully, for a good year for all of us. As you know, I like to update you on my faux farm.
You need it.
You need it, huh? Well, I got disappointing news. I wasn't at my faux farm very much this month. In fact, we ended up going to Branson and had a lovely time in Branson. We went to Sight and Sound and saw the Nativity play, which is fantastic. If you've never seen it, it's worth the trip. I've seen it on a disc before, but it's nothing like being there. It's a completely different experience. And we also got to go on a showboat that didn't go anywhere. I was pretty sad we didn't get to go out on Table Rock Lake or anything, so we got to sit in port to watch show tunes. But we did have a farm experience on our trip. Get in the van. I rented this van because I wanted my wife to have a nice cushion ride down there. The Subaru's a little rough, you know, so got this nice van, and we got there just fine. And next morning we're discussing where we're going to go, and I said, I got to get gas. I'm almost out of gas. So we pull up at the gas station. I'm filling up with gas, and my daughter comes out. She says, do you hear that? Well, you know how I hear things. I don't hear things well. And she says, I think it's a cat. I said, no, it's probably just the metal of the building, you know, the wind's blowing hard and how it squeaks. And she says, no, I think it's a cat. So I'm putting gas in and I'm getting ready to leave, and my wife says, there's a cat in the car. And I said, no, there's no cat in the car. So we started looking around, and sure enough, I hear this meow, and it sounds like it's coming underneath the hood. I open the hood, look in there, I can't see anything, and it's all quiet now. And I said, oh, it must have been in that car that took off. And we just heard it echoing real. Before you know it, meows again. I think it's in our fender. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to get into this fender to see if this cat's in there. Luckily, you know, I'm all crippled up and pretty portly. You know, I can't slide in there with the engine anymore. And my nephew Casey was there, and he jumped under the car, you know. And he says, I can hear it. And before you know it, we found the cat. It's sitting on the engine block, right above the transmission. And it's just meowing. And by this time, a guy from another pump has come over, and he's underneath the car too. And they're all trying to get this cat out. Yeah. Finally, the cat gets brave enough to jump and to run, and it runs straight into my brother's car and up into his engine. So here they all go over to his car, you know, and he's got a fancy car, and he's got one of the cars that has an air ride suspension, you know, and they're trying to get under there. He says, just a second, he lifts the car up. Must be nice. Anyway, we ended up opening the hood, and there was the cat, and I grabbed it, and the fellow that was helping us grabbed on the cat. He's holding it with his arms, you know, and his wife says, no, you can't have it. And there's another cat that's kind of around in there. She's saying, oh, maybe that cat will take care of it, blah, blah, blah. And of course, I got two girls, and they just love baby animals. So we said, oh, we'll take the cat. You know, I don't want to let it out here anyway. If we're going to let it out, we need to do it out in the woods or something. So we got the cat, we got in the car, and Emma's holding the cat, and she's just petting it. And we go in to do something. She says, I'm going to give us something to drink. And so she put the cat down. The cat went into the dashboard. This cat was in our car for 2 days, in the dashboard. We're driving along near, meow. I haven't heard him in a while. You think he's okay? Meow. So every night we would put some water and some food in there, and the cat would come down when we're not there and eat the water, eat the food, drink the water. And I said, okay, we got to get some traps. I need traps at the faux farm anyway. I trap a lot of stuff, and all I have is a skunk-sized one. I need a small one. I need a big one. So we go to the store, and we buy a 3-pack of cages. It was cheaper to do that than buy a single. So I put this little tiny itty-bitty cage in there, put some food in there, and we went to the boat show. And came out, sure enough, we had a little cat trapped in the cage. Then we had to get it back to Wichita. Anyway, the good news is the cat is in our house, and it's a little girl, and his name is Spark. I wanted to name it Sparky or something like that. Since we found out it was a girl, they changed it to Sparkle. But it just shows me God's love. God's love for us. He went to the nth degree to rescue us. Even after he rescued us, we still run from him. We still try to hide. We still are embarrassed of our sin. But he only has good things for us. We only had good things for the cat. We wanted to help the cat and feed the cat. And the cat didn't know that. I think of God's great grace and mercy and love through all of that. So we have a new addition to the faux farm, a little tiny cat, and our big cat doesn't like it. So anyway, I'm going to be starting a new series, and I'm going to be doing the book of Daniel. This is one of my favorite books, and of course I say that every time I talk about a book, but this really is one of my most favorite books. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction, and I'm going to have Emma come up and give her trip to Israel and how that turned out, and it's going to apply to the remainder of my message. But the book of Daniel is a book about a teenager that was taken captive by Babylon. Babylon came 3 different times, and the first time they came, they conquered, and they took the best of the best people back with them. After that, they came back and took back more and more people, but just common people. And Daniel was one of those. Daniel and his friends, Hazariah, we know him as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, took those fellows in the first wave because they were smart, they were crafty, they knew what they were doing. Daniel becomes a prophet. And not only that, he is a prophet to the royal court. He is in the place where the king is. We see that Daniel has survived as a prisoner all the way to his prime minister. And he helps 3 different kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. He is in this position all 70 years of Israel's exile. Daniel contains the history of the world written in advance. It talks about the Babylonian Empire. It talks about the Medes and Persian Empire. It talks about the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. And then the last empire, which is partly Roman and partly, we don't know, partly clay. He uses symbology, he uses images and beasts and visions and dreams to explain all these things. And we'll go through some of these visions, and you'll see that Daniel actually answers what these visions are. Not only do we have the visions, but we have the answers through Daniel. This book outlines the course of history for the Gentile nations. Daniel is a parallel book to the book of Revelation. And in order to study some of the aspects in Daniel, we're going to have to bring in some of Revelation and blend it together so we can get a full picture of what's going on. Daniel is a book of courage. Young teenagers that came in there and were taken hostage. Courage in the midst of captivity. Daniel is a book about a captive teenager that becomes a prophet and a prime minister. We'll see in this book not only courage, but conviction in the face of fearsome foes and kings and fierce fangs and fiery furnaces. It's a very special book full of miracles and prophecy. The key word about the book is prophecy. Daniel is the most prophetic book in the Old Testament. Daniel is the Old Testament parallel to Revelation. In chapter 11, it has over 100 specific prophecies that have been fulfilled literally. Some of Daniel's prophecies were fulfilled in the life of Jesus. And we'll look at all of those prophecies and see how they were fulfilled. Daniel is the key and foundation to understanding the last days in the book of Revelation. Interesting side note, most all of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. But when Daniel comes on scene and then we start to deal with the king Nebuchadnezzar, it is written in Aramaic. So from Daniel 2:4 to 7:28, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. The rest of it's in Hebrew. Now, I'm going to have Emma come up, and she's going to give a overview and some stuff that she's learned, some new stuff that she's learned while she was in Israel. And then when we're done, we're going to talk about the red heifer.
This is scarier than I thought it was going to be. I mean, I did competitions and I'm used to speaking in front of people, but there's a lot of people. So I went to Israel from November 20th to December 2nd. And I saw a lot. Unfortunately, I can't talk about everything I saw right now. My dad still wants to speak. But here's a pretty good roadmap of kind of what I want to talk about today. The Temple Mount. I mean, that's the first thing just about everybody asks me. As soon as I say, oh, I went to Israel, they go, oh, how was the Temple Mount? Did you see the big golden dome? How was it? So I obviously want to talk about the Temple Mount. I'd like to talk about Jerusalem, just walking the streets, because that was like the first thing we did when we got there. We got to Israel, and then we immediately started walking the streets, and all the vendors coming up to us and saying, oh, here, it's free gift, take it. And then they ask you for $10 for that free gift. Then I want to talk about the city of David, which was a newer thing that they've been uncovering recently. And then Bethlehem, which was my favorite part, so obviously I had to put Bethlehem in here. And then lastly is when I start talking about the red heifers, which will lead back into my dad's message. So first, looking at the Temple Mount. So I called this Pressure on the Temple Mount because, holy cow, was it restricted up there. We had to go through metal detectors, take everything out of our pockets, no bags, no big coats, none of that. They were very strict before you could even get up there. And then, once we were up there, we had what I like to call our little stalker. Throughout the whole Temple Mount, there was a guy following us and making sure our tour guide wasn't saying something that they didn't like. And so every time we'd stop, our tour guide would say, look, over there, you see that guy standing? That's the guy that's been following us. And you could watch him the whole time, and he'd be making faces at stuff that she was saying. And so it was really interesting, but I brought some pictures of the Temple Mount up there. And then the first one is obviously the Dome of the Rock, but the second one would be where we believe the temple would be placed. So many people will say it's where the Dome of the Rock is, but when you look at the way the East Gate lines up, that secondary spot is where it looks like the temple would need to be, for it to be something Jesus could have looked straight into from the East Gate. So we're walking around up there, and we get into the Temple Mount itself, and we're stopped by the guys that man the gate. And they're looking at us, our group, and making sure our clothing is all modest enough and we can actually walk through. And there were two girls that ended up being told that they had to wear a skirt. And I think it is just the funniest thing, because one of the girls was already wearing a skirt. She had a skirt to her knees and some spandex on under them, and she was very well covered, and they said, no, not good enough, and they made her wear this really ugly skirt that went all the way to her feet. And the other girl was wearing pajama pants, and I guess they're not fans of pajama pants. And neither of them were very happy, but it was really funny, and several of my pictures I have them walking in these really ugly skirts. These gray skirts with bright yellow stripes down the sides, and just, ugh. And we saw several guys up there too, where they'd been wearing shorts and they were told they had to put on the skirt because the shorts weren't good enough. But the Temple Mount is very restricted, very heavily armed. There were guys with guns, soldiers everywhere. And it was weird because we didn't see like any Jews up there. And so I was talking with the tour guide about it, and she said that actually most Jews aren't allowed on the Temple Mount anymore. At the moment, it's mostly the Muslims that have control of it. They have a mosque, which, beating myself up over this, I didn't get a picture of the mosque. So they go up there, and we heard their prayers the whole time we were on the Temple Mount. They're so loud. We're on the other side of it, and we can still hear them praying. There were a whole bunch of parts of the Temple Mount that were restricted. You couldn't go in unless you were of their religion. So you can go down below where you'll see some of the original foundations of the Temple Mount and some of older, ancient stuff, and you have to go down the stairs to go there, and you're not allowed to. Our tour guide's been down there, and it was because she saved a little girl who belonged to their religion, and they offered to give her like something to repay her for it. And she asked to go down there. She saw it, and she's like, it's amazing. She was sad that nobody could get up there, and she had a lot of insight like that. She was very well known in the area, very knowledgeable about the area. And I think one of the things she said that stuck out to me the most about the Temple Mount was she was talking about a little girl, maybe 10 years old, that had gone on the Temple Mount with one of her tours. And the little girl was wearing pretty modest clothing. She wasn't wearing anything like outrageous or anything, maybe like a skirt. And the guys that told our people that they had to wear skirts told the little girl she had to wear a skirt. And obviously the tour guide asked why, because this girl's not wearing anything inappropriate. And the guy said, well, I feel attracted to that little girl. Therefore, she needs to cover up so I don't have to hold myself back. And if that doesn't explain the status of the Temple Mount, I don't know what does, because it's all controlled. Everything is about power up there. And that's what our tour guide was talking about, is these men that are trying to tell people to wear different things are trying to have power over such a holy site. Goodness, my throat has been rough today. Are trying to have power over such a holy site. And that's something that I saw throughout Israel in general as a whole. So that's part of the reason I wanted to start with the Temple Mount, is because I wanted to talk about just how much pressure and tension there is up there. And the whole time we were all tense, waiting to be kicked off or waiting for the other shoe to drop. Next is walking the streets of Jerusalem. And like I said, this was like the first thing we did, and it was amazing. The coolest part about walking the streets of Jerusalem was all of the architecture, all of the old stones, everything. People are living around it. So up in this top picture, there's a guy running his cart who's selling like fruits and vegetables. Well, he had his stuff strewn all about this really pretty archway in the wall. And you see that everywhere. The vendors have taken over the old houses, old rooms and everything that have this beautiful architecture, and they're selling like candies out of it. Or they're selling touristy shirts that say, I Heart Jerusalem. Stuff like that. It's everywhere. Everybody's living around this. In this other picture where you can see like a mosaic on the wall, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a sliver up at the top. That's under a walkway. So people are walking on top of that. And then you come down here, you can see these mosaics and pillars down there. And then you keep going, and right there is a little shopping area where you can buy all sorts of like touristy stuff and paintings. And there was a guy in there that was selling bits of rock from the path and from that area where he'd painted like the Jerusalem skyline on it. And he was painting just scenes he saw in Jerusalem. And I just thought this was so cool to see how the people there are living. You know, I think of ruins as being ruins, like not something that people are living on or that people are building on, but that's what they're doing over there. They're still living in old Jerusalem. This is where the temple was, and they're still living here, and they're still using the old walls and everything. It's like part of their life. And I just thought that that was an amazing thing to see. And then we would walk around, and I think one of the first things that I was told going to Israel was be careful where you put your wallet, be careful where you put your phone, there are pickpockets. You're gonna lose it, you know? And so we bought me this like thing to go under my shirt that'll hold my passport and everything, and then come to find out I don't need my passport everywhere I go. But we went to the Mount of Olives, and we spent like a whole day just walking, and that was terrible. Like I loved it, but I am not built for walking that much. So we're on the Mount of Olives, and we're all standing around talking about the sights we can see. We can see the Temple Mount straight from where we're standing, and our guide all of a sudden stops, and she pulls up her shirt, and she goes into her whisper, which was a little microphone on her face that we had little earbuds we could hear her from, and she goes, there's a pickpocket over there, be careful, guard your stuff. And looking around, all of us were like, you know, we're all patting our pockets, and we're all like scrunching up, and everybody's freaking out. And I think the guy noticed because he's looking at us like, what's wrong with you? And eventually he starts trying to sell us these big posters of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem skyline. And my Uncle Robert's like, don't buy from him, don't buy from him. I have a good friend, and he'll give us a good price on one of those. And so we walk a little bit more, and we meet this good friend that'll give us a better price on those. And he says, this guy will give you one for, I think it was $3. And our tour guide goes, $3? He's going to make you pay $3 for that? And she walks over to him, and she talks really fast in Hebrew, and she sounds mad. And eventually she comes back and she says, $2. You can buy this for $2. You should have seen the look on my uncle's face. But it's very interesting the way that Hebrews interact with each other, or Jews interact with each other, compared to how tourists are interacting, you know? You look at the way that my uncle got kind of swindled on that, and then our tour guide was able to step in, and she was talking to the guy for maybe 2 minutes, and the guy had automatically like knocked down his price. And so just about everywhere we went, I stopped kind of relying on my great uncle Rob and started kind of relying on the tour guide. Like, is this worth this? And she goes, no. And she talks to the guy, and all of a sudden it's cheaper. And that was something that I really noticed just walking the streets of Jerusalem. You'd think that that would be a more intimate place, something that mostly was Jews walking or people who lived in Israel. But just about every corner you turned on, there was I Heart Jerusalem stuff, or stuff for tourists. Stuff like little handheld mirrors. What am I going to do with a handheld mirror, you know? Stuff that you wouldn't naturally see, just like people actively using in their daily lives. And I was amazed at how touristy Jerusalem had become, and Israel in general was. Next is the city of David, which I was amazed to see this. So these two pictures are of a palace that they've just recently opened to the public to look at. This would have been one that Solomon built in remembrance of David. So they just opened this up to the public when we'd gotten there. Our tour guide hadn't even seen this location yet. And that could be that she hadn't gone on a tour in that area yet, but she hadn't seen it. So I'm inclined to believe it was probably pretty new. We're walking along, we're looking at the palace and everything, and she's kind of giving us some history on it. And right, like, in line or above where we were was a whole shopping mall, like a whole bunch of stores, a whole bunch of everything. And me and my cousin went into a coffee shop there, and we were like, okay, we're gonna get some coffee. And so there's three choices. There's coffee, iced coffee, and vanilla. And so we're sitting here thinking, okay, what's iced coffee gonna be? Is that just gonna be what we think of here? You get coffee and you put ice in it, or what's it gonna be? So we were trying to figure it out. We ended up deciding on vanilla, because we thought vanilla was gonna be vanilla iced coffee. It wasn't. We got this weird frozen white drink, and it was like drinking straight up creamer. Weirdest thing I have ever tasted, but I would go back and get another one. And we had a whole bunch of just misunderstandings like that walking through. And I think one of the funniest ones was, you can probably read what the first picture says, toilet. We were walking through and we were looking at a noble house that was right next to that palace. And we saw this stone and we're like, what's that stone? Why has it got a hole in it? And the tour guide was like, oh yeah, go on ahead, guess. And so we're trying to think of it. We think maybe it's an olive press for olive oil or something. It's a toilet. And I don't know if you can tell that this was on my second or third day in Israel, because I got so excited. I was like, that's a toilet. Oh, I need a picture of the toilet. So I took a picture of the toilet and made a note to remind myself it was a toilet. And as soon as I got back to the room and had Wi-Fi, I sent my parents a picture of the toilet. I was so excited to see that toilet. But there was an amazing amount of ruins and history in that area. And the coolest part was you could go from the palace and everything into that shopping area and turn, and then you'd be right in the city where people were living. Houses, actual apartments. We passed like a group of schoolgirls going to school while we're walking through the palace area. That's like their commute, is going through that. And the whole time I couldn't help thinking how amazing it would be to live here, to see these monuments and to see all of this architecture every day and to get to enjoy it like that. I think going into it, I wasn't prepared for the awe I'd feel. I think of people like ancient peoples or older civilizations, and I think dumb. I think all they could do was hit two rocks together and hope to make a fire. But looking at some of the architecture that they have there, it's like, wow, we can't build that. How on earth did they make that? One of the coolest things, and I didn't put a picture in here, we saw a mountain that King Herod had hollowed out, and he built his own palace in the hollowed out mountain. And this isn't even Masada. Masada is a whole other palace he built on top of a mountain. And he had like a whole theater for bringing in guests and entertaining them and everything. And it was a beautiful sight to see. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go up and see the mountain in person. We only got to see like the outline of it because Israel is divided. There are areas that Jews and Israeli citizens aren't allowed to go into, and that's what that second picture up there is. The sign pretty much says anybody who's an Israeli citizen is not allowed to go past this point because you're going to die if you do, and that it is against the law. Luckily, we had a pretty brave tour guide who would go into those areas anyways, even though she was an Israeli citizen and was a Jew. She would say, oh, we can't go down this road. We're going to go through the back entrance, and then I can keep being your tour guide through this area. That scared me a lot. Every time we do that, I freaked out. I was like, are we going to get in trouble? What's going to happen? One of those places where we had that was in Bethlehem. So you're probably looking at this and you're wondering, Bethlehem times 2. What do you mean Bethlehem times 2? There's one Bethlehem. Well, we ended up meeting a guy who brought the red heifers over, and of course I'm going to save the red heifers for last, because best for last. But he said he doesn't think the Bethlehem that we went to was the real Bethlehem, and he said, I've got a different site, I'll show it to you. But first I'd like to talk about the Bethlehem we went to first. So this Bethlehem is where a European queen came in, and she said, okay, I know Jesus was born in a cave, and I know this is the general area where they say Bethlehem is. And she found a cave, and she said, okay, that's the cave. And she built like a huge church on it and called it the cave where Jesus was born. And that's kind of how we have this big, glamorous church up here in this cave that has all the stuff in it. That's how we have that. And that church is divided between 3 different religions. And of course, the Catholic part is huge, and they have all the rosaries, they have Jesus on the cross everywhere, and that's a picture of the Catholic part. And the cave lies right underneath the Catholic part of the church too. And the whole time I was in Bethlehem, I was thinking, wow, this is beautiful, this is amazing, I think this is my favorite part of the trip. And this is like day 5, so I've still got over half the trip left, and I think Bethlehem stayed my favorite part, because we got to walk the streets of Bethlehem. Unfortunately, our tour guide couldn't actually walk with us, because that was one of those Israeli citizens aren't allowed places. And I was kind of disappointed because our tour guide kind of seemed to have a whole spiel that he'd memorized that he just gave to everybody. And that was different from our tour guide, who typically had a personal touch to things. He didn't really do that. But he walked us down the streets, and I saw 2 Starbucks knockoffs. And it's not a lot, but it's weird that there were 2 of them. There was Stars and Bucks, and then there was Square Bucks. And I have pictures of those signs if anybody wants to see them after this. I didn't want to put them in the slideshow. But Bethlehem was amazing, and it was even more overrun with people trying to sell you stuff constantly. And we were told, keep your hands in your pockets, because they will put things in your hands. They will grab your hand and put it in your hand, and then make you pay for it. But it was still an amazing, beautiful sight to see. That church is massive, and there's this tiny little door to get into it. We even befriended one of the guards that was guarding this church, and I think I have the picture in my phone, which is another picture I didn't put up here. of all the girls posing with that guard. And he looks like the happiest guy on earth because there's so many of us. But anyways, then I'm going to move on to the second Bethlehem, which this is a picture of it. It was much less like grand, much less touristy, you know. There wasn't a huge city around it. There wasn't a huge church. There really wasn't anything there aside from the ruins that you could see and a hotel like right next to it. So we walked through Bethlehem, and of course they show you how tall these walls would have been, and the guy talked about how this is where Ruth would have gone. So when Ruth goes with Naomi, this is where she would have come, and this is where she would have gone to the gate to be claimed by her kinsman redeemer. And so he showed us the gate that it would have been, and that was a very cool thing to see. That wasn't something I never connected it in my mind that that was Bethlehem, like the same Bethlehem. And so it was amazing to see that, and then to also know that this is the Bethlehem where there wouldn't have been any room. And as much as I say that, I also can't tell you for sure that this is that Bethlehem. It could be the other one. But walking through it, I just felt like that was right. And so that's what I'm going to stick with, was I think that that was the real Bethlehem, mostly because this second picture here, the smaller one, was on like the slope next to the Bethlehem that we went to with this guy. And this is where the shepherds would have been keeping their sheep. So there was like a whole bunch of buildings, a whole bunch of caves, everything in that area where you would have seen both people harvesting wheat and also the shepherds keeping their sheep. And one of the interesting things that that guy was telling us was the Bethlehem we went to first is on a hill. And if you're going to harvest wheat, you typically throw it up in the air. But if you're on a hill, the wind's going to carry that away. So you don't want to be on a hill if you're going to harvest wheat. So you'd much prefer to be not in the valley, but in a plateau kind of halfway through. And that's where this would have been. So the grain wouldn't have been carried away by the wind, and it would have been a good place to cultivate it. And then the next picture, the bigger, grander picture, is the cave where that guy said, this is where Jesus was born. And as much as that's a cool thing to be able to say, look, I'm showing you the cave where Jesus was born, I don't know if I can 100% agree with him on that. I think it was like what he would have been born in. But something that was really cool is, I don't know if you can see it, I'm holding a 1 shekel coin up next to the engraving. And what's on the 1 shekel coin is what would have been the Star of David before. So it would have been a 3-pointed thing. What happened is they later flipped it and put the two together, and then it soon became an actual star, because they called it a star. And so what you see carved into the hill there, or into the rock, is that same symbol, which would have symbolized that this was owned by the house of David. And that's part of the reason he's so sure that this is where Jesus would have been born. And I just thought that that was an amazing thing to see. That old of a carving in there telling us that this meant something. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the red heifers, which this flows directly from that, because the guy that took us through that Bethlehem area also talked to us about the red heifers. So the rabbis in Israel said, okay, we think it's about time we start getting red heifers and trying to sacrifice again. And so they're sitting there thinking, who are we going to call? And somebody knew a guy from Texas and said, well, if you're going to get one, it's probably going to be from Texas. So they talked to the guy, and that's who ended up guiding us through Bethlehem and talking about the red heifers. And what he ended up doing was saying, yeah, Texas is your place. And then he had a bot, like that would go on a computer, that went through and checked every single ranch that would sell red heifers, all of them. And he gathered them all up, and he starts messaging them saying, hey, we want to buy some red heifers. Can we buy some? And so eventually he got a lot of feedback, and people were like, yeah, we'll sell you some. I think the coolest part of that part of the story is there is one guy in Texas that is raising red heifers specifically for sacrifice. He said, I loved hearing in the book of Daniel about the red heifers, and I thought that one day when they start sacrificing, they're going to need one. So I bought a bright red bull and several bright red heifers, and I started breeding them, hoping that one day it could come from me. And if that's not God working, I don't know what is. So they obviously got some from him, and what has to happen is they have to get these heifers. They have to say they want it before it's born, because as soon as a cow's born, they put the tag in the ear, and then it's blemished, and it can't be used for sacrifice. So they had to notify these people before these cows were born, and then once they're born, they have to let them age up a bit, and then they have to check every single hair on each cow's head and make sure that they're all red. One of the problems they ran into was, where does red stop being red? So parts of the hair could be white at the end or black at the end. And so they had to be absolutely certain that it's fully red. And I can't imagine taking a huge cow and sitting there for however many hours looking at every single hair. I don't think I've even seen all the hairs on my head, to be honest. And it just, the commitment that they've all put into this. Then, so they have their cows, and they got 18 perfect red heifers. And they ended up calling rabbis over, and the rabbis came in, they looked at the heifers, and they said, we have a problem. The guy says, oh no, great, what's the problem? The rabbi says, you brought me too many. I can't use this many. And he said, well, just pick the best 7. So they picked the best 7, and they went to take them over to Israel. Come to find out, you're not allowed to take cows from America to Israel. They won't let you do that. So they went through all of the laws and the regulations regarding air travel, and they found that you can take 5 pets with you. So they used that loophole to take their 5 pet cows over to Israel. So they had their cows, but next comes 2 problems. First, they need a priest who can actually carry out the sacrifice. And second, they need land on the Mount of Olives to carry out the sacrifice. Well, the first one's pretty easily solved, which the guy who got the red heifers was thinking this one's going to be difficult, finding a priest. Because if the priest wants to carry out the sacrifice, they cannot be within 9 arm lengths of death, ever. Or else they're automatically tainted and unclean and they can't do it. Well, turns out Israel has raised 5 kids, 9 arm lengths away from death. And they're between the ages of 13 and 19. So they have 5 of them. And what they have to do is they have to walk certain paths. So they'll build archways under the paths, 9 arm lengths of air beneath it, so that you know you're not walking over bones. Because I could be standing on top of bones right now, and I wouldn't even know it. So they have to be born in special places, they have to walk certain paths, and they have to be kept completely clean and holy. And I can't imagine the parents sacrifice doing that too, having their kid having to live like that, you know? And it's amazing that they went to that length. But there's also the land on the Mount of Olives, which the Mount of Olives was covered with stuff. They've got the big grave sites there. They've got churches up there. They've got a whole bunch of stuff up there. And I'm walking on the Mount of Olives, and they mentioned, I've heard that you have to have land up there, and I was like, wow, you're never going to find land here. It's all taken, and who wouldn't want to own even a foot of land on the Mount of Olives? What would that be to say? Well, it turns out 12 years ago, there was a guy that bought land on the Mount of Olives thinking, I'm going to build a restaurant here. And he kind of had this little part of his mind thinking, this would be a great place for the sacrifice. But he's like, no, I'm going to build a restaurant here. Well, that restaurant didn't get built. And now he has the land, and he's volunteered it for the red heifers. So now, I'm pretty sure the red heifers are in that area. He wouldn't tell us exactly where the red heifers are, because that's pretty dangerous. They're not even supposed to have them. But that covers those 3 things, and they all worked separately. It all came together without one person coordinating it. This was all God's will, and it's very obvious from the way the guy was talking. And it was amazing hearing his firsthand account of it, hearing all the lengths he personally went through just to get the red heifers up there. And he's a really cool guy to hear from. And if I can remember what the name of his foundation is, I can give it to you guys later if anybody wants it. He's been trying to send preachers and pastors over to Israel. And so his foundation will fully pay for a preacher or a pastor to go over to Israel. It will cover all the expenses to do that, because he thinks you'll be a better speaker on the Bible if you know what Israel looks like and you know what you're talking about. And he was a very interesting person to talk to. So he talked about that, and then he also ended up talking about, he found another place with Joshua where it looks like a footprint has been carved into the mountainside. And he said that this would have been something that Joshua would have left to mark where the Israelites went. And that was a really cool thing. So he had a lot that he could share. He had a lot to tell us. He had a lot of sights. But yeah, then he went on to talk about sacrifice, the actual sacrificing of said red heifer, which this was the coolest and scariest part of the whole trip. It's very cool to hear how the sacrifice is going to happen, to hear that they have the red heifers. But it's also scary to think that we're getting that close to time to sacrifice in the temple again, and time for them to stop sacrificing in the temple, which leads to end times. And I couldn't help but think through the whole time there that, wow, a lot of these people don't even realize what they're building up to, starting sacrificing again. They follow the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's about it. They don't really recognize the New Testament whatsoever. And it's very sad to know, and it's a very scary thought that so many of them aren't going to realize what's coming, and that a lot of them aren't going to understand what's coming. Anyways, the sacrifice. So when they go to sacrifice the red heifer, they have to completely burn it, to ashes, completely gone, and then they take those ashes and they're going to mix them with water, and that's how they will be cleansing their priests to do everything else that they do in the temple. And after this, I'll hand the microphone back to my dad, but I think the most interesting thing that was said about this part was the ashes that they put into the water are only 7% the burning of the cow. Almost all of it's from the wood. And so after he told me that, I kind of sat there and I was like, why does it have to be specifically a red heifer with all the hairs bright red and everything? And it was just a weird thought, that only 7% of that water that they're going to be using to cleanse is going to be heifer, So anyways, suppose I'll step down and let my dad talk. But that only scratches the surface of what I saw. So if anybody wants to hear any more, I've got 1,000 pictures.
Well, she's related. She's long-winded. Hosea 3, 4, and 5. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, without a prince, without a sacrifice, without an image, without an ephod, without a teraphim. Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord his goodness in the latter days. Here we see Israel trying to return to God. We're getting together the red heifer, so that we can do the purification of the priests and build the temple. But what does that mean to me? What does that matter to us? What are the importance of the red heifer ashes to us? In Daniel 9:27, Daniel 9 is probably one of my most favorite chapters, and we'll probably spend a lot of time in there, but I want to look at this one verse. This verse says, and he shall confirm a covenant, and this he is the Antichrist, with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and the turban shall be poured upon the desolate. I want you to look at that red word in there. It says, he is going to cause the sacrifice and the worship to cease. If we're having sacrifices, what needs to happen? There needs to be a temple built first, right? We can't have sacrifices without the temple. You can't have a temple without priests. And here we have 5 priests that are coming of age that can do this. But not only do we need these priests, we also need ashes of the red heifer. You see how all this is coming together, and you see how we know that it's getting closer because these things are falling into place. In 2 Thessalonians 2, and we won't read the whole chapter, or the whole thing because we're running out of time, it says in here that let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, that day being the day of the Lord, except there come a falling away, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself all that is above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He can't sit in the temple of God unless the temple's built. And here we have a push to build the temple. We've got the red heifers. We've got the priests in place. If you go over there and you talk to the Temple Institute, even when we went there in 2009, they have made almost all of the utensils they need in the temple to conduct temple business. They can set this temple up, I think they said, within 90 days, get this thing up and going. If the Antichrist is going to stop the sacrifices, we have to have a temple. Second, the temple must be built before the beginning, or it has to be built before we leave at the rapture, or at the very beginning of the tribulation. Tribulation is only 7 years long. There has to be something built before that, so that halfway through the tribulation, the sacrifice can be stopped. Can they build the new temple now? That's an interesting thought. She talked a little bit about it. You got the Dome of the Rock up there. It's controlled so heavy that the Israelis can't even go up there. They're afraid they're going to go up there and pray. Here's an overview, and it's kind of hard to see. And I put the picture, I duplicated one of her pictures. But you see right here the Dome of the Rock. You see the gold-topped dome right there. And you see the Mount of Olives is over here. You see it says Mount of Olives Information Center. And I should have brought a pointer. If you follow where it says Catholic Cemetery, you see that green word there? That is the eastern gate. It's got like 2 circles. You could sit on the Mount of Olives and look in there and come right to the stone that they think is the Holy of Holies. Most people think the Holy of Holies is under the Dome of the Rock. But if you look just to the left, there's another pavilion that's covered, and this is it. This is where they think the Holy of Holies could be. They could actually build a temple right on top of that, next to the Dome of the Rock. He said, but Dave, I know this is in your mind, and you think all this will work out. Well, I want to show you some of the steps that the Israelis have taken to push this on. First, we have the red heifer sacrifice could take place in 1 year in Jerusalem. This was written in September of last year. It was just a few months ago. This is interesting. This came out December 22nd, just a few days ago. The Knesset committee will discuss whether the new minister will be appointed for the third temple. They are already trying to appoint government officials to oversee the third temple. There is a big push right now. The ashes of the red heifer is setting everything off. The Muslims say he who has the ashes of the red heifer controls the world. It's kind of interesting that even they see that. Jesus is coming again. This is just showing our steps on the way to the end of the world. Are you ready? Jesus loves each and every one of you. Since we were sinners and have turned our back on God, fellowship with God has been broken. But the penalty of sin is death. How could we ever pay for our own sins? We couldn't. God sent his only son to this earth. We just celebrated Jesus' birthday this last week as a baby, as a perfect man in God, sinless, to die for you in your place. Jesus died on the cross for your sins. He paid the penalty for you. Please come to Jesus today and receive your free gift of salvation. Father, thank you for this morning that we could get together and we could study your word and look at these wonderful and marvelous things. Lord, that we would see your plan falling into place. Don't let us be dismayed and don't let us be worried. God is in control. We know that you have everything is working according to your good will. Everything is following your statute and what you want. We see how in Daniel how you set up kings and you take kings down, Lord. We'll look into that this in the next few lessons and how you're in control of everything. Lord, let us rest in that and let us be soul winners for you, Lord. Let us be salt and light. Let us go out into the world and pass the good news, the good news, the free gift of salvation. Lord, thank you for this time and bless us as we go out through the week. In Jesus' name, amen.